Hi, my name is Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to my July wrap up. So today is the 11th of July. I've got 3 books I want to talk about. First up, My Policeman by Bethan Roberts. So this was published about 10 years ago, but I only became aware of this book within the last year or so because it's been made into a film. I picked it up because I just thought it sounded interesting. So it's set in Brighton in England. Between the 1950s and the late 90s. Most of the story takes place in the 50s. We have 3 main characters. We have Tom, who is the titular policeman, Marion, his wife, and Patrick, who is another one of Tom's love interests. And we know this from the blurb, so that's not a spoiler. We hear from 2 narrative perspectives. So we hear from Marion and we also hear from Patrick. And we learn how each of them meets Tom, how their relationship with Tom develops. But interestingly, we never actually hear from Tom himself. The narratives or sort of surround him. So even though he is, I guess, kind of the focus of the book, and he is who is referred to in the title, we never really get to know him properly, only through the eyes of both Marion and Patrick. The book has a really interesting sort of opening few pages, which sort of sets up a certain level of intrigue, which I thought was really interesting. So I just wanted to read like the first 2 sentences to show you what I mean. So this is in 1999, this is being told from. I considered starting with these words, I no longer want to kill you, because I really don't, but then decided you would think this is far too melodramatic. You've always hated melodrama and I don't want to upset you now, not in the state you're in, not at what might be the end of your life. So in those first few pages, we get a bit more information about the characters sort of in the present day, as in 1999. And sort of the situation that they're in at this point, but it's only as we go through the story and we hear from the characters back in the 1950s, we come to understand what's led them to being at the point that they are in 1999. I really like this book. I found it very engaging. I thought it was interesting. It has a nice level of plot, which I enjoy. It looks at what it was like to be a gay man in the 1950s in England. It is in many ways pretty devastating and difficult to read at times. Also interesting to hear from Marion's point of view as a young, quite naive woman going into her marriage with Tom. The sort of the section on Marion and Tom's early relationship put me in mind a little bit of On Chesil Beach by Ian McEwan. Just sort of similar sort of tonally to that. I really enjoyed it. I would highly recommend it. I can see why they've made it into a film. I'd kind of be interested to watch the film, maybe. But yeah, I thought it was great. Next, I wanted to talk about Emma by Jane Austen. So this is one of the books which I mentioned at the start of the year that I wanted to try and read this year. One of the classics I wanted to head to. My relationship with Jane Austen is that I have never managed to finish one of her books. I have DNF'd several of her books over the course of my lifetime. And I had DNF'd Emma as a teenager. I wanted to give this one more go because my favourite film is Clueless, which of course is based on Emma. And this got off to a really, really good start. Immediately I was quite engaged. I was into the plot. I enjoyed sort of having in mind the film Clueless as I was reading it, and I was surprised how similar that film is to the plot of this book. I wasn't quite expecting that. Like the whole first section is called Volume 1. Sort of the main plot point, if you like, is around Emma doing a drawing of Harriet. Harriet's this sort of young, slightly naive girl who Emma's trying to sort of mould and matchmake. So Emma does this drawing of Harriet, and Mr. Elton decides that he wants this picture to frame it for himself. And in Clueless, Cher takes a photo of Ty, and Elton wants this photo to hang up in his locker. I was like, oh, it's the same thing. So yeah, I was quite engaged. Then we got to the next section, volume 2, and I started to get quite bored. And I have DNF'd this. I read half the book, which, to be honest, is much more than I was expecting to manage. But yeah, I just got bored. For me, a lot of this book seemed to be people riding around in carriages, going to each other's houses for dinner and sort of gossiping about other people, which, you know, sounds like a nice way to pass the time. But I just wasn't that interested, so sadly, I have DNF'd, and I think this is the end of my relationship with Jane Austen. I have also DNF'd another like 3 books already in July, but I'm not going to talk about them now. I'll save them for my next DNF wrap up. I have finished this short story collection, which is Ghost Lover by Lisa Taddeo. So this is quite recently published in the last sort of couple of months, although some, if not all, of these stories have been published elsewhere in the past. 2 of them have won the Pushcart Prize. I really, really enjoyed this. I read this over the course of maybe a month or so between finishing other books, and it was great. I read Animal, which is a novel by Lisa Taddeo earlier this year, one of my favourite books of the year so far, and this is sort of really quite similar in terms of content and voice. Lisa Taddeo has such a bold voice, and I absolutely love her writing. The stories centre women, and they look largely at those women's sort of interactions with men in terms of relationships or otherwise. They also do touch on female relationships too, and the sort of interplay between female relationships and male-female relationships. It is not as sort of devastating as Animal is, but probably check out Content Warnings, but it's definitely sort of milder, if you like, than Animal. But I loved it. I think it's great. If you have read and enjoyed Animal and you don't mind short stories, I imagine that you will get on with this. I thought it was excellent. Hello, it's Friday now. It's the 15th of July, and I have a couple of updates. So first of all, I want to talk about The Luminaries by Eleanor Catton. So I mentioned at the start of the year that this was one of the books that I wanted to pick up at some point this year. And I mentioned recently, I think in the mid-year freakout tag, that I was going to hopefully head to it soon because I got it out of the library. And surprise, surprise, I have DNF'd it. So I read less than 200 pages, and like, I didn't hate it. I just wasn't compelled to keep reading it, basically. That's it. Since DNFing it, I have Googled like the plot summary to see what I'm missing out on. And to be honest, I didn't entirely understand the summary. However, no spoilers, but it, you know, the way it goes does sound kind of interesting. It probably would be my kind of thing, but I'm just not interested enough to read another like 600 pages. This is like 800 pages in total, and I just wasn't engaged enough to carry on. So I have DNF'd that. So as I say, it's the 15th of July today, and I've DNF'd, I think, 6 books this month already, which is quite a lot even for me. So I wanted to pick up something that I knew I was going to get on with, something that was going to keep me engaged and entertained. So I headed to a reread of Piranesi by Susanna Clarke. So this was my favourite book of 2020. I absolutely loved it, and it was one of the books at the start of this year that I said I wanted to reread, so it does contribute towards that goal. I thoroughly enjoyed rereading Piranesi. It was just what I needed, and I just loved it. It was interesting to reread it because when I first read it, it had only just been published, and I went into it without knowing really anything about it. I hadn't heard any reviews, and so on my first read, I had no expectations of the book at all, which I think probably enhanced my first reading experience of this because I just loved it so much. So interesting to head back to it now. Obviously it won the Women's Prize last year. I do still think it's kind of wild that this won the Women's Prize, because even though it was my favourite book of last year's shortlist, it's quite a curveball. But yeah, it's great. I got through this really quick actually. I forgot how quick a read this is. I can understand, obviously, having heard lots of reviews of this, particularly since it won the Women's Prize. You know, some people, it's a bit of a Marmite book, isn't it? Some people really don't like it. And I can understand, I guess, maybe people being frustrated with Piranesi's naivety. But I just loved it. Briefly, you probably know what this is about, but we follow Piranesi, who's our main character. He lives in a vast sort of series of halls where there's these statues. Every so often the halls become flooded. The only other person he has contact with is someone called The Other, who he meets with twice a week, and Piranesi sort of conducts experiments for The Other to sort of record the findings. And I won't say any more than that about the plot, but I love the way it goes. I think it explores some interesting themes in really interesting ways. It would be a spoiler to say any more, I think. But I loved it. Hello. So it's, I think, over a week later, and I've read several more books. So first is Jumping Jenny by Anthony Berkeley. This is also published as Dead Mrs. Stratton. Both terrible titles in my opinion. This is Golden Age detective fiction. The book opens at a fancy dress party where all the guests are dressed as famous murderers and their victims. And surprise, surprise, somebody at the party dies. The book is described as an example of the inverted mystery subgenre. So I won't say too much about what that entails because I don't want to give spoilers, but yeah, it was interesting because there are certain aspects of the story and the way the story is told which are different to your usual murder mystery novel. I would recommend this if you are a fan of Golden Age detective fiction because I think it's an interesting example of the genre. I will say that there is a note from the publisher at the start, and some of these British Library crime classics do have this note from the publisher, which basically says there are some stereotyping and some attitudes which would not be endorsed by the publishing standards of today. And in this instance, this book is quite wildly misogynistic, so be mindful of that. Next, I read Consent by Annabel, Lyon. So this was on last year's Women's Prize long list, and I didn't read it at the time because my library doesn't have a copy. But I picked this up in a bookstore a few months ago because I just thought it sounded interesting. I wasn't sure what to expect because I hadn't actually heard that many reviews of it, and I absolutely loved it. I'm surprised I've not heard more about it actually. So we follow two sets of sisters. We have Saskia and Jenny, who are twins, and Jenny is severely injured in an accident. And then we have Sarah and Matty, who are sisters as well, and Matty needs full-time care. And it's really around the relationships between each of these sisters who don't know each other. Things that happen in the story that impact on how those relationships change and develop. And the book looks at consent in a number of different contexts and in a number of different ways, which I thought was really interesting. My only criticism, if I were to have a criticism, would maybe be that it looked at, there's a lot going on in this book, so maybe I would have liked a bit more depth on some of the issues which are touched on, but I absolutely loved it. I thought it was brilliant. It is quite a devastating read in many ways, I would say, so be aware of that, but no, I absolutely loved it. Then I read Zorrie by Laird Hunt. So I picked this up because I heard Fraser Simons talk about it, and it's not my usual kind of book, but I really liked it. So we follow Zorrie, and it's basically her life story. And I am not usually a fan of sort of sweeping life stories, but I really enjoyed this. It's quite a short book. It's only just over 150 pages. So Zorrie lives in Depression era Indiana. She is orphaned. We see her sort of having to fend for herself. We see her as she grows up. She gets a job working in a factory painting luminous clock faces. She gets married. You know, it's sort of about her daily life, the sort of tragedies that happen along the way. I think it's a very well written book. I liked it. I didn't love it, but that's probably because it's not, this type of book is not my favourite thing. But I liked it a lot. I'd recommend it. I can't see anyone really not getting on with it. It is quite a melancholic read, I would say, in tone, but very, very good. Next up, I read Metronome by Tom Watson. So this is a sort of a mystery thriller survivalist story. We have a couple called Aina and Whitney, and they have been exiled to live on this remote island because of a crime that they have committed. And they have been living on this island now for 12 years, and they are coming up for parole. So they have had very, very limited contact with the outside world during this time. And in fact, in the last few years, they've had, I think, no contact with the outside world at all. So we see them waiting to see, I guess, what parole will involve. Will anyone actually come for them? Because they have no idea what has been going on in the outside world during this 12-year period that they have been exiled. In that way, it put me a little bit in mind of Leave the World Behind by Rumaan Alam. As the book goes on, we come to understand the nature of the crime that they have committed, which has led to them being exiled. And for me, that was probably the most interesting part of the story, because when we find out about that crime, it shows the sort of socio-political environment of the world that they are living in, and I thought that was quite interesting. It's quite an action-packed novel. It's quite fast-paced. It's quite a page-turner. I found it engaging and I enjoyed it. This is a debut novel, and I will pick up whatever the author writes next. And then I picked up Blue-Eyed Boy by Joanne Harris. So this is the second book in a series, a crime series that Joanne Harris has written, set in Mowbray, which is a fictional town in England. The first book in the series, Gentlemen and Players, was one of my favourite books that I read last year. This book is very, very different to the first book. The first book is set in a school called St Oswald's in this fictional village, and that school is mentioned at parts in the book, but as far as I can remember, I don't think any of the characters are present in this book, and I think this could be read as a standalone. So what's this about? I'll just read you the first sentence of the blurb. So, once there was a widow with 3 sons, and their names were Black, Brown and Blue. Black was the eldest, moody and aggressive. Brown was the middle child, timid and dull. But Blue was his mother's favourite, and he was a murderer. So, this is told in what's called web journal entries. It was published in 2010. It feels very, very dated in terms of these blog entries and how they're written, and also the writing style in general. To me, it feels like a book that was written in the 90s, even though it wasn't. So we hear from this man who's known as BB, and it's his blog entries, and it's him sort of recounting events from his life. But as the reader, we're not sure what's true and what's not. And then at the end of each of his chapters, so the blog posts, there are comments from other people online who are following him, and they'll comment on what he's written, and I think generally it's assumed that what he's writing is fiction, but we're not entirely sure that it is. This didn't work for me really at all. I felt like it was convoluted, it was overly complicated. I'm still not entirely sure I totally understood everything. I felt like it was too long for what was going on. I think the writer had an interesting idea for a plot, but it just didn't work in the execution. There are some twists and turns along the way, and whilst I didn't predict those twists, at the same time they weren't that surprising. So yeah, I was quite disappointed by this. I will read the third and fourth books in the series because I think those are more similar to the first book. But yeah, this was not great. And then the final book to update you on for today is Love Me, Love Me Not by Kirsty Capes. So Kirsty Capes is the author of Careless, which was on this year's Women's Prize long list. In my opinion, it was one of the best books on the long list. This is Kirsty Capes' second novel. And this was great. I very much enjoyed it. So our main character is called Lucy, and she's 26 years old. And we find out at the start of the book that she has recently discovered that she was adopted. And the way that she has found this out it is sort of by chance, really. And so it's a lot about the impact that has on her feelings of, I guess, betrayal from the family who have raised her, and, you know, her trying to understand why they kept this hidden from her, because seemingly most people in the family are aware of her being adopted. And then also it's about the impact that has on her own sort of self-identity as well. I think Lucy is a really interesting character because, as well as all that's going on, she has sort of built for herself this identity in terms of how she wants to be perceived by other people, so both her friends and also in the workplace. She struggles with social interactions, and a lot of the book is about her sort of relationships with her friends and with her housemates and different things, and I guess her trying to find herself in a way and come to understand who she is herself when taking away the mask that she has put on in order to try to sort of be perceived in a certain way. I'm not sure if I'm explaining that very well, but anyway, I thought she was a really, really interesting character. I think Kirsty Capes is a brilliant writer. I think if you enjoyed Careless, you are almost certainly going to enjoy this as well, and I would highly recommend it. Hello, it's now the end of the month and I've just got 2 final books to wrap up. So first is The Blood Flower by Alex Reeve. This is the 4th book in the Leo Stanhope series, which is a crime mystery series set in Victorian England. Most of the books are set in London. This one is set in Portsmouth. So by this book, our main character, Leo Stanhope, is working as a journalist. He's married and he becomes embroiled in this case whereby 2 people have been murdered. Both those people are sort of living on the fringes of society, so the police are not that bothered about investigating their deaths. At the same time, part of this case involves the so-called blood flower, and part of the mystery is Leo trying to work out what the blood flower is, what its significance is and where it is. I enjoyed this book. I would recommend you read them in order if you are going to pick them up. What I like most about this series is not so much the actual like mysteries, but the central character of Leo Stanhope and sort of his story that runs through the series. And funnily enough, I was the first person to put a rating for this on Storygraph, which has never happened before. And then the final book I read this month was My Sweet Girl by Amanda Jayatissa. I heard about this from Books and Lala. This is a psychological thriller, which is just what I was in the mood for, and it hit the spot. This was so enjoyable. I loved it. So our main character is called Paloma. We have 2 timelines. So the present day timeline is set in San Francisco, where Paloma lives in an apartment that she shares with her roommate called Aaron. Right at the start of the book, Paloma discovers Aaron's dead body in the apartment. And then, through various circumstances, the next time she goes to look at the body has disappeared. So she goes to the police. The police are not really interested because Aaron is living there illegally. There is no documentation to show that Aaron even exists. And so Paloma is sort of questioning herself and her sanity and what on earth could have happened. In the historic timeline, Paloma is 12 years old. She's living in an orphanage in Sri Lanka. So she's living there with other girls, and they are every so often visited by these American couples who make donations to the orphanage and who sometimes decide that they want to adopt one of the girls from the orphanage. So we know, because of where we are in the present timeline, that Paloma is one of the girls that does get adopted by a wealthy American couple and ends up living in the USA. This is a really pacey read. It's quite twisty. There was one moment where I gasped out loud because I didn't see something coming. There were other twists which I sort of had an inkling about, but that didn't spoil my overall enjoyment of the book. The narrator has quite an acerbic wit about her, which made the book somewhat funny in parts. I mean, it's not a funny book, but you know what I mean. And yeah, it was just really engrossing and a good time. So those are all the books that I read in July. Let me know what you've been reading. Let me know if you've got any recommendations for me, because I'm always on the lookout for more recommendations. Let me know if you've read any of these books or if you are planning on reading any of them. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you're well, and I'll speak to you again very soon. Bye.